Hello and welcome back to JLXP, the Josh Leesman Experience. I am Josh Chat Leesman, and boy, has it been a pretty crazy week. Been working from home, been trying to plan out a whole bunch of additional podcast content. I did the first episode of Chrono Break with Prawley, where we talked about H2K's 4-0 day back in Worlds 2016. I was charting out a bunch of the other big moments in league history, and I think learned a lot from that episode. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just wait for the game that you really want to rewatch. That'll be done in the future. But also, there's been some great news. This morning, the LCS and the LEC announced that they're going to be back for online play to continue the LCS split, which for me personally is really exciting because League is such a big part of my life. But I think it's exciting for other reasons, in the sense that with so many people being working from home or in isolation, the sense of community and entertainment that LCS and LEC can bring is going to be really nice to have back. In terms of this individual podcast, I had recorded a stats talk with Tim Sevenhuysen. He's the guy who runs Oracle's Elixir and has done stats in League of Legends for about 5 years. He's a friend of mine, and we decided to talk about stats for 30 minutes. What stats are good in League of Legends, what stats are bad, what stats he's worked on. He explains his early game rating, which is a stat I really enjoy from his website. So if you're interested in stats, check out the first 30 minutes of this podcast. And then also earlier today, I asked Twitter for a bunch of questions and took the best ones, thought up some more in-depth responses, so it wasn't just me reading a question and immediately answering it, and did about 30 minutes of a solo Twitter mention podcast. So I hope you enjoy both the Tim chat as well as the Twitter answers that I give later in this podcast. And I look forward to seeing you on the rest of the podcast, and hope you enjoy it. All right, welcome back to JLXP. Right now, I am joined by Tim from Oracle's Elixir. You want to tell everyone your name, Tim?
Yeah, my name is Tim Sevenhuysen.
Yeah.
It's very simple and straightforward. It only has 11 letters.
Yeah. A lot of people who follow the scene closely probably hear some people talking about Tim, or you follow him on Twitter, or you have I think It's Magic on Reddit sometimes, where you actually end up having some pretty insightful comments. But for those of you who don't know, Tim and I have known each other for almost 5 or 6 years now. I think it was around 2015 where we started chatting a lot, because I and a lot of other analysts in the community were like, hey, this is a really cool third-party analyst site, Oracle's Elixir. And you were really communicative with everyone into what people wanted, what people needed. And I mean, at the time, you were just doing this as a part-time gig way back then. Do you want to talk at least a little bit briefly so people can get to know you a little bit about how you started Oracle's Elixir and then eventually moved into what you're doing now?
Yeah, for sure. So March 2015 was when I officially put Oracle's Elixir online. And it was just something where I had a bit of a background in League. I actually started watching Season 2 Worlds. It was the first kind of exposure I had. Around that time I was looking for kind of an esports viewing fix, because StarCraft was starting to slow down, and I'd been like StarCraft Brood War kind of fan back before, there was YouTube or Twitch or any of this kind of stuff. So you had to try to find third-party video viewing apps to watch this stuff, and it was all overnight. So, the League of Legends kind of caught my fancy as, hey, here's this, it's not StarCraft, it's something new that I can get into. Some of my friends played it, but it took me a few years to kind of realize how I could get involved. I played a bit. In 2015, I came across ways to access the match history data. It was just there, and I started, copy pasting off of websites, putting it into spreadsheets, and then posting it on a website, aggregating it all. It wasn't long before people helped me kind of get better access to it and did better things from there. But then, with the website, doing some content, doing some coverage, connecting with people like you, and you were one of the first people who really kind of supported my work and kind of validated what I was doing, that it was useful, that it was interesting. And so I've kept running the site since then. I've done a bunch of other things in the past 5 years, though, from freelance writing for the Score Esports or other places, or Unicorn. Spent a couple years running Shadow Analytics, which is a pro team analysis platform. And currently I'm the head of esports data science for Esports One, based out of Santa Monica. doing a variety of things, such as a fantasy platform for League and some other projects.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of professional stats people in League of Legends esports, you definitely have one of the more impressive resumes, especially based off of the way you got into it, which was just compiling spreadsheets and then had people notice. What we'll get into kind of in this episode is I wanted to talk about how to evaluate teams' performance kind of relative to their record, because I've liked stats as a storytelling resource a lot for League, and I think that's how it's usually used. People see a high KDA, or you kind of intuitively know, oh yeah, 600 DPM across the season is high, and 1,000 in a game is really rare. But those numbers end up changing massively depending on meta or what type of champions are being played at the time. I remember I was casting the 2016 World Final, and I think Core JJ's Zyra did 100,000 damage in a match. And you could say like, wow, that's the most damage a support has ever done in the League of Legends match. But like, how does that actually help you evaluate like a team's performance relative to the record? So this kind of overall topic, you who with Shadow have worked a little bit with teams in the past about what type of analytics they've been using, or even I'll share some of my thoughts of like which stats are necessarily the good ones versus the bad ones versus the overhyped ones. But the first question kind of for you here that we'll talk about is, how do you feel like we should evaluate performance of a team relative to the record?
Yeah, I think really what you want to find is ways to measure parts of the game that are relatively universal.
Mm-hmm.
And you also want to find ways to measure not just the outcome, but the way that they arrived at the outcome. So there are a handful of stats that I like to use, that I've developed over the years and use more often.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that I tend to lean on the most is, first of all, there's one that I came up with several years ago called gold spent percentage difference.
Right. And these are all of these ones available on Oracle's Elixir? Because I know this is one I actually like a lot too.
Yeah. So GSPD is up on Oracle's Elixir if you go into the team stats.
Yep.
And this one, what it does, it snapshots the amount of gold spent by the entire team, by both teams, as of the last moment of the game. And then it does a percentage difference, which is basically, to simplify it, it's basically a ratio, except that it's symmetrical. So a ratio, if you do 11-9 or something like that, the higher team, it's not the same on both sides of it. 11-9 is higher than 9-11 in terms of the positive versus the negative.
Right.
And so I do a bit of a different approach to it, so that the negative is the same as the positive, just with a negative sign. That way you're getting a symmetrical number. Sure,
that's definitely like interesting math stuff. But basically the way that I end up using the stat is, hey, for instance, C9's GSPD this split has been 13.3%, which is actually really, really high, right? Yeah. What do you, just if other people wanted to use this stat, what are your baselines for what is normal? Because usually this number to me is actually really low.
Yeah, it's usually going to be, most teams will fall within plus or minus 3%.
Mm-hmm.
If you're above a +5, you're doing really well. If you're below a -5, you're doing quite poorly. So yeah, plus 13, really, really high. That means that on average you end the game, with that translates to something like 55% of the gold in the game.
Yeah,
was spent. So what this really tells you is the margin of victory.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not just saying, hey, we won, but here's how convincingly we won. Here's how much we were ahead at the moment that we won.
Yeah.
And so it's just a more nuanced way to say, was this a win that we really smashed them, or sometimes you can win from behind, which is a very unique thing for esports, and specifically for League.
Yeah.
There's no points metric that you use, and we have more points, therefore we won. No, you kill the Nexus or you don't. You could be down 20,000 gold, kill the Nexus and win.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest examples of this that I remember, just because it was a high visibility game, was like G2 versus SKT semifinal last year. I imagine the gold spent percentage difference in that game, or in that series, was either in SKT's favor or very close to being in SKT's favor. We had some other stats for that I actually liked using in terms of evaluating teams' performances. These are stats that are more internal to us, but it's like the major lead, major deficit stats of like what percentage of the game is a team actually behind or ahead or even. And that's like 51.5% of the team's gold. If you have that, you are a major lead. And if the other team has that, you're at a major deficit. And if you're somewhere in between, then the game is considered even. That one I actually find to be fairly illuminating.
Yeah, I remember when Aika came up with that one. I talked to him about it a few years ago. He actually came up with that one before joining Riot.
Yeah, Aika is currently a stats for the LEC. One of the stats.
Aika and Connie over there. Yeah, and so my version of that one is actually the other kind of advanced gold metric that I tend to use, where I call it gold percent rating. And so it's similar to what you're talking about with kind of major league, minor league, so on. But instead of bucketing them out, it just takes a continuous metric. So it'll say, right now, at any given minute mark in the game, because that's the level of data I have access to. I don't have every second like you guys have. We take the percentage of the gold held by each team, and then we just average that out over the course of the game. So if you're ahead 51% to 49%, that chalks in as a +1, rather than being this is an even game. It's a +1, and then we average out that. So then the gold percent rating ends up being not just the end result of the game, like GSPD measures, but throughout the game, how much ahead, how much behind do you tend to be? So again, using the Cloud9 example, their GPR this season has been +2.39, which means at any given moment within a game, on average, they're holding 52.39% of the gold, which is quite far ahead of that 51.5% threshold.
Right. Considering the second place team in the league is 0.38, which is TSM by that metric. So like, You gave a relatively long explanation for GPR, but if you wanted to just like mega simplify it, like someone goes here and they're just trying to figure out a little bit about who is stronger, GPR is just who is ahead the most during a game, not necessarily the snapshot at the end, which is what GSPD is for.
Yeah, exactly. Just how much are you winning at any given moment or losing?
Yeah, my favorite stat on your site, and I'm definitely biased because you and I talked a ton about this when you were developing it, is your EGR, which is what's considered an early game rating. And I've explained this a few times on podcasts, but I always, if I'm doing it in a game, I just like, I can't. It's too detailed of an explanation to do. But it is essentially a number that tells you how good a team's early game is. And this was really interesting because a lot of it was, okay, when should we consider the early game or the mid game or the late game, and how are you even breaking up these games at the time? Back in 2015, you settled on 15 minutes as what the early game is, and then you also tried to encapsulate like what a gold lead plus objective lead in terms of translating to victory. Like what percentage can you snapshot at 15 minutes? And it's like, it's obviously not going to be 100% accurate, but I actually find the stat pretty useful in terms of determining how good a team's early game is. More useful necessarily than, 1,500 gold to 15. But what does that actually mean? And I think this stat has done a decent job at tackling what percentage chance it is to happen. So I'll just kind of give it to you now to talk about your thoughts on early game rating.
Yeah, and it's one where I think if a model like this, most people aren't going to understand the technical kind of underpinnings of it, and that's fine. I think if it gets to the point where people trust the source of it and are willing to move forward with it, that's fine. For people who really want to understand, like, okay, it's built on a logistic regression. Here are the metrics that go into it. What does that mean? This is real statistics. This is not counting stats, right? This is not +5 of that and -6 of this. This is the stuff that gets me really excited, and it's why I had so much fun developing in the first place. But the actual, as of the latest version of it, which I updated late last year, it looks at the goal difference at the 15-minute mark, and also the number of each type of dragon that each team is holding, and then which side of the map they're on, because historically different sides of the map have had different win rates. And so based on all of those inputs, it models out from all the games of the current split, what would we expect? How likely would each team be to win based on the current state of the game?
Yeah.
And then it just reports that as a percentage. And then the sister metric to that is the mid-late rating, which effectively just takes what's their actual win rate, what's the difference between their actual win rate and their expected win rate based on their early game rating, and then just gives that as a plus or a minus.
Yeah.
So, if we expect you to win 9 out of 10 games, but you've only won 7 out of 10, you'd have a -20 mid-late rating.
Yeah, this stat has been fun to kind of track over the years because, in a sense, there's a bit of historical archive since, correct me if I'm wrong, each year's or split's early game rating or mid-late rating is batched on a certain number of games, Right. So you're not just using the last 7 years of game data that you have.
No.
You're using, is it unique to the split or unique to the tournament?
To the split, yeah. I actually, when a new split starts, I actually don't report EGRs for the first 2 or 3 weeks because we need to get enough games of data to actually have a useful model. So they'll usually show up around week 3 or 4, and just based on the off-season changes that'll happen and the changing meta, you can't actually, when you look back and calculate it out split by split, the quality of the model or how well it's able to predict reality, basically the accuracy, changes quite a bit split to split. Some splits it'll be 75% accurate on we think this person will win and they did. Some splits it'll be down to 68, 69. Those are all good models, but some splits the early game is much more influential just based on the meta. Yeah. And so you have to be able to adapt that split over split.
So then this split, how do you feel it's going? Is it an early game split or a late game split? Because there's obviously been a lot of debate about this depending on which league you're watching or which caster you're talking to. What are your thoughts from looking at the stats?
Yeah, based on the numbers, it's not as early game heavy as 2019 was. 2019 was historically early game weighted.
Okay.
Based on, I wish I had the numbers in front of me because I was actually running this recently, building out some more automation in it. But
right.
I believe that the 2019 models were the most effective early game based predictions there have been in the history of me running this.
Wow.
And 2020 has backed off a little bit. It's still a lot more early game focused than some of the older seasons where there was a lot more stalling, a lot more wave clear scaling.
Yeah.
But so it's still fairly early game weighted, but 2019 was such an early game focused year.
Yeah, I find that super interesting too, because like every Worlds or every MSI, every time the regions come together, there's always these debates about how you win League of Legends. I remember, I think it might have been 2016 G2 when Weldon was on their coaching staff. He was making these statements that, oh yeah, the first 20 minutes of the game actually aren't important. The way you win League of Legends is 20 to 40. And then we also have like the IG World Championship year where it's just like, oh yeah, you picked winning lanes and then you out executed and that was the way you found victory. So that being able to actually try and define it statistically is really fascinating to me. Was this kind of some of the stuff you were talking to teams about when you were with Shadow and trying to do a little bit of help on that side, or was it more simple stuff?
Yeah, when I was leading Shadow and kind of delivering that product to pro teams, it was a little more on the basic side or more the technology side rather than the advanced statistical metrics side. I think to some extent pro teams and coaches follow the trends of the statistics being used in the public discourse. So the stats that are used on broadcast, for example, are the stats that coaches end up talking about more.
Right.
And this is largely because most coaches in esports have certain skill sets, and those skill sets are not necessarily deep quantitative analysis and statistics and so on.
Everyone will have their own specialty. Yeah, everyone has their own specialty.
So yeah, the Shadow was more about how do we track our scrims effectively? How do we scout solo queue without wasting hours every day, pulling the data together? But a lot of automation, a lot of efficiency so that they could focus on the stuff they're best at without wasting time on it. And some of these more kind of advanced metrics or deeper models are things that if teams are going to do stuff like this, they usually will build it in-house and kind of protect it.
Yeah.
And they won't talk about it publicly, so you won't necessarily know they're doing it. Some examples of that, I know there are certain coaches who have done matchup based CS differences or kind of lane matchups. They'll say historically this pair of champions has this outcome in the lane, and now how well does this player do relative to the expectation? And there were teams doing that internally before somebody came and wrote an article about it on my site. And so there are certain things like that, and I imagine there are other ones that I don't know about. I know that there are definitely coaches who talked to me before and have sometimes kind of looked for input or some feedback on we're generating an overview player rating metric. And we're going to combine all of these stats and come up with kind of an omnibus kind of thing, kind of like the quarterback rating approach.
Yeah, I've
never really seen the outputs of those for good reasons. So I can't speak to how high quality they are. I've never gone ahead and done it myself, but there are things being done. There are things that people are attempting.
Yeah.
And it is getting a little more common for teams to actually hire in-house staff to build out those things.
Yeah, I talked with Keen a little bit because it was almost like a story point, trying to apply like a very rough war to League of Legends. Wins over replacement is like a big baseball stat. How many average wins is this player going to add to your team across a 162 game season? But we just kind of use that as a theoretical thing with no statistical model and be like, you know what? Some days probably like a 3. Because this game, and this game, if he didn't perform at that level, like just by the eye test, they end up losing if he's not solo killing those people. We don't necessarily need to talk about like a god stat. If a team actually did develop that, no way they should share it if it's accurate. No. But it would be super cool if the stats community could find something that's agreeable. I just don't think they will with a lot of the ways that so many of these stats require like way more context in other sports. Baseball is an example of a game that has basically the simplest context to apply, where for the most part it's pitcher versus hitter, and then you do have a little bit of added elements with how good your fielders are, but like that's the most isolated you get. And then the NBA has gone through a big stats revolution where they did find more advanced metrics and they've been able to apply, but it's still never going to reach the level that baseball has hit analytically. But in terms of like League of Legends, something that we were going to get into is which stats do you think work and which stats just don't work in terms of evaluating things or being consistent?
Yeah, I think there are definitely metrics out there that, I mean, to define what works or what's useful, it really is like, is this useful to me on some level? And,
it's true.
you know, there's not some like abstract scientific standard for, is this a correct stat or not, right? Is this useful to me? Can I use it to make decisions? And is it not like actively misleading me? So I think there's some good examples. I think for people who don't know Spellsy, he's one of the guys. He was doing stats with Riot Broadcast for a long time, and then he's currently working with Golden Guardians within their management group. And he's a guy who pioneered a lot of stuff, and he also gave me a bit of a boost when I was first getting involved. He was the one who implemented Baron Power Play, for example. He didn't come up with the idea, but he implemented it.
Yeah, that's super cool.
I believe he came up with jungle proximity and forward percentage as well. You know, some of these things that are very integral to the broadcast experience or kind of the discussion now, and he's the one who made sure that they were, you know, whether or not he came up with the idea or just put it together. I think those ones are really interesting.
Yeah.
I think jungle proximity and forward percentage, both of those are starting to feel a little dated and could really be updated to be a lot more nuanced.
What do you mean by that?
I've always, so for jungle proximity, for example, what I've always wanted to do, and I've just never been, I've never had hold of the data to actually build this out or really had a reason to do it myself. But rather than, I have a personal bias against setting thresholds on things and saying we are over or under this threshold, so count it or don't count it. I prefer,
because that's jungle proximity. It's 2,000 units to an ally. Yeah.
What percentage of your time are you closer than 2,000 units? And I'd love to play around with something where it says, you know, 2,000 units and 200 units are different. And so what is the average actual distance away? And I think you'd have to put a max cap, on which point you say, I'm not on the same side of the map anymore. So, you know, 8,000 units versus 2,000 units is not meaningfully different, for example. But I just have a kind of a natural aversion to category-based stuff. That's why I came up with goal percent rating as well, which is based on a continuous scale rather than assigning buckets and forcing things to be dropped into buckets. I think both forward percentage and jungle proximity both could be, I think that the best way to serve those would be visualizing it on a map, either where you place breadcrumbs saying where people walk or have some kind of heat mapping. I think there are things you could iterate on with that really tell a more nuanced story. And yeah, just because I think dropping things into buckets is one that you can lose. You're kind of reducing the amount of detail or amount of nuance that you can have in those stats when you kind of force it into certain shapes.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, you have to have those steps, and I think those have been really useful in pushing forward the boundaries of what kind of stuff can we talk about, what's available, and they've been useful for sure.
Yeah, and I think some of the stuff that used to be useful sometimes isn't useful depending on the meta that we're currently in. CS difference is a stat that, I mean, originally it was just CS at 10 or CS at 15, and it gets bounced between the 10 and the 15 mark actually pretty frequently. Like, I think a lot of times with turret plating right now, I think CS at 10 is probably the better stat for this year, even though CS at 15 is kind of more the standard, because then you have a more played out laning phase. But like that stat actually across an entire split is ruined as soon as someone plays Senna.
Yeah.
Or it is ruined as soon as Jankos plays Braum and you're doing a Zyra Khan funnel. Yeah. Or rather like Braum Zaya or something. So those types of things, I think for those of us that really like looking at those stats, it actually has been kind of frustrating because then we're trying to pull off of other stats. I agree with you that jungle proximity and forward percentage, that's actually a cool idea if we could find a way to better visualize like what is 50% versus 45%, because sometimes the 45% is actually a harder camp than the 50. It's just he happened to be clearing raptors a lot and he was in proximity to his mid laner. But those are the stats that I end up like, I don't necessarily have a feeling that a high or low jungle proximity is bad. It's just a data point. Oh, he was around teammates a lot versus not that much. And then I will infer analysis further, which is, I think, one of the hardest things in terms of making a God stat is because if you did something like that, you'd then have to start deciding if jungle proximity high or bad was good. And I just don't think you can do that in League, you know?
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of metrics. Really, you could divide metrics into different types. There are performance metrics, and then there are playstyle metrics. And you know those positional ones are definitely playstyle metrics. Kill participation is generally a playstyle metric, not really a performance metric. I think it's one that is a little bit gray, a little bit in between. You know, but who's gonna look at at a top laner with 55% kill participation and massive CS share and just doing so much split pushing and say that he's done poorly, right? Like if he's doing his job as a split pusher, he's supposed to have low kill participation. In fact, the team probably shouldn't be fighting much at all, and suddenly your whole story has to change. So yeah, there are definitely stats that you can't just say high is good, and forward percentage is clearly one of them.
Yeah. What do you think about damage stats? Because I'm always back and forth on these. They're dictated by so many factors. Like damage will go up as the game is longer, just because you have more items and you're doing more damage, and differentiating between good damage and bad damage or easy damage and useful damage is difficult. Like an Ezreal is always going to have, I mean, not always, but usually higher damage than any other AD carry, but it doesn't necessarily mean Ezreal has it when it matters. But in terms of like the other stats, I kind of feel like damage is pretty good as long as you're being smart about the way you're approaching the stat. Yeah,
no stat in League should be allowed to tell its own story. Aside, well, maybe there are a few that you could kind of get close to that, but basically you always have to be allowing the stats to kind of speak through an interpreter. And so, a good analyst has to be able to look at those numbers and know what those numbers can say and what they can't say, and then talk about them that way. So, I mean, it gets as simple as when you're looking at CS differences and saying, oh yeah, but this is a player who has played multiple Senna games and they don't CS. We need to look at something else. All the way up to, we're talking about damage stats. Okay, we recognize that this team plays, longer games. In longer games, damage numbers tend to be higher per minute. Therefore, or they play a lot of poke champions and assassins have lower damage per minute, but like you were saying, kind of more, each point of damage potentially is more useful because it could lead to
it's a kill.
So yeah, there are certain places where you can adapt your strategy. So it's been quite a while since I've really used CS differences in lane as a metric. I still report it because it's really good for the historical purposes of it, and I think taking it away would feel like a big gap, but I always report golden experience differences now.
Yep.
I've actually been putting them together as a single metric in most of my, if I put out an article or an infographic or something, I'll combine them and call it gold plus experience difference. I think, what you lose with that is now you're not just talking about the head-to-head farming matchup in lane. Now, if they go roam and get a kill, they're going to get golden experience from that. So now you're telling a more comprehensive picture rather than narrowing it down to a specific small topic.
Yeah.
So there are pros and cons to that, but I think it's a lot more robust because, that Senna is still picking up gold experience.
The tricky thing with that is finding, if I'm talking more about a broadcast use for golden XP difference, I completely agree that it's a more complete story. I think it just takes a lot of work in conditioning the audience to know what you're talking about. Like we recently put experience graphs on the left sidebar of the LCS broadcast, and it's really interesting because I think one of the earlier mock-ups had, here's how much experience they are off a level. And yeah, they're 200 experience from the next level. But no one knows what 200 experience is. Is it 100 cannon minions or is it 2 ranged minions? Like there's just no... I mean, there's a few people that know it, but it's a completely obtuse concept
store, right? So you don't get your hands on it and really feel it as points. You feel it like, oh, I'm almost level 6, right? But you don't interact with it as a number.
Yeah, since you've been doing stats on it, do you know it like experience? Like what's a good XP GP at 10 or something?
So I actually, before I started combining golden experience in that combined laning metric, I investigated them to make sure that it was appropriate, and I actually found golden experience are on a very similar scale in terms of differences. So if plus 100 gold at 10 is pretty good, plus 100 XP is too. Gold diverges more widely, so if you kind of drew it out as a bell curve, it's going to have longer tails. It's easier to have really low gold difference or really high gold difference, whereas experience tends to be more kind of grouped around the middle. You don't get big extremes, but the actual scale is fairly similar. So when you're putting them together, if you have a plus 200 gold plus experience difference, it's not that unsafe to assume that 100 could be gold and 100 could be experience.
Cool.
The scale is quite similar. You don't have to like manipulate them so that one is not overpowering the other.
Yeah. That's pretty much all the topics that I wanted to hit with you. Do you have anything else that you want to discuss about stats and relating to the LCS, which hopefully the current plan is to have it back this Saturday and LEC on Friday, which is super ambitious, but I'm looking forward to it. Do you have any final stats thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I think, there's always a lot more you can talk about if you start digging into specific teams, specific players, and actually, saying, and here's how you can use a number to say how good this team is. For example, looking at FlyQuest, this split up coming up to the current week, I did an article about how their advanced metrics painted them as kind of a 4th place team, but here's their 2nd place record, and they went and they lost a couple games. It doesn't always work out that well because actually Team Liquid's advanced metrics have been reasonable,
right? And then they fell on their face.
So it's not always that simple, but I think the actual application of the stats tends to be a lot more interesting than the theory of them.
Yeah.
I don't think there are many people out there who enjoys the theory of them the way I do, but that's kind of the point of it, is that I can enjoy the theory and hopefully earn enough trust from the audience that they go, okay, and now this metric that he uses all the time means something and I can work with it. And to your point about, making sure the audience is comfortable with the numbers being used and understanding what they mean and so on, I think there's definitely, a lot of work that has to happen to bring them on board with it. I'm biased towards believing that the audience can pick things up pretty quickly, and probably more quickly than they've been given an opportunity to. But I also, I'm coming from my own perspective on that, where I'm deep in this all the time. Yeah. So, it's a bit of a challenging balance to strike, but I try to be out there, being one of the people who, for those who are really interested in a more numerical approach to evaluating the game, I give them something they can engage with or explore on their own. Download a data set and play with it and see what they can come up with themselves. And yeah, it's just a fun space to be in.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tim. I think for my part, I'll push a little bit more experience knowledge, because I think that's actually a really good stat to do, and combining golden experience actually seems like a cool idea. Continue to use GPR, GSPD, early game rating, mid-late rating. Those are all solid stats for those of you who want to try and dive in a little bit more analytically into the stats behind League of Legends. So, Tim, thanks for calling in and having the chat.
Yeah, thanks again.
All right, thanks. All right, welcome back to JLXP. This segment is kind of unnamed at the moment, whether it's inbox or at me or mentions, but basically asked Twitter for questions that I would be able to cover on this podcast. And the idea was to give slightly more in-depth answers to Twitter questions. So it's not like I just read the question and immediately spout off a reply. I've combed through the responses. I've thought about them a little bit. I've done a little bit of research, and hopefully it can lead to some interesting discussion. So the first question we got coming up is from Ori and the John of Wisps at John Skovic on Twitter. He says, what is your take on asterisk seasons of professional sports and esports? Example, the 99 NBA season, 2017 MLB, World Season 1. do the asterisks matter in the long run, or does it depend on the specific circumstances? Do you think the current league season will be one of these asterisks? I don't know if this season will be one of the asterisk seasons or not, because I think it really does depend on how long leagues are being played online, what the online play looks like, what the international tournament structure ends up being, how long each region or team can be highly competitive for. I think the larger question of what my take on asterisk seasons are is, while they are asterisk for a reason, and when you're having really in-depth comparisons, it does matter, for the general public and for many of the higher level conversations, it doesn't matter. So even using the 1999 NBA season where the San Antonio Spurs beat the New York Knicks in the finals, like, it was a shortened NBA season, but they still won the title. Like, spring split in LCS, I'm not going to asterisk the MVP. I'm not going to asterisk the LCS first team. We've played most of the spring split. So I think we are definitely in a period of a lot of uncertainty. And I think asterisks are actually interesting to think about. But yeah, to answer the question, I do think overall they're there for a reason, but for the most part, they don't matter. Next question we got is from Dillian Adams. He says, do you think this week off has given TL the time to level up and possibly go undefeated in the next 2 weeks? I think I saw this in a YouTube comment, actually, and someone was like, hot take, this time off for TL is actually really beneficial for them. And then people responded further down and said, actually, I've seen this take everywhere. And I kind of agree that if you think about it for a little bit, hey, yeah, this just gives Team Liquid more time to level up, because we don't think that what Liquid has done in the past few weeks is going to be their steady state. And everyone's just kind of wondering if they will be able to improve in time to make playoffs, not are they capable of improving. So even though it's actually been only an additional week, and I think a lot of it has been in flux. I mean, TL announced that they're shutting down their training facility for most people. So like, I think the players can still go in there and practice, but a lot of players are still going to be practicing from their apartments. We don't know exactly how they're going to be playing. It's going to be really wild what happens in the LCS with online play, because playing on stage is a different environment than playing at home. And here's kind of a weird thing I've been throwing around in my head is, so we know that veteran players generally have an advantage for stage games if they've done it before, and for playoff games if they've done it before, or for international events if they've done it before, because every moment has its own feel. The pressure of a playoff game on stage, the pressure of the stage in general, the pressure of traveling internationally and playing against completely foreign players who you may not know the tendencies of. I don't think that playing online LCS is going to be the same as just playing at home. I think it's going to be its own unique thing. So I actually don't know exactly who this will benefit and who this will hurt. Not talking about the time, more talking about the environment with which they are competing. I have a hunch that actually the newer players are going to have a harder time adjusting to this, just because they haven't adjusted as much in the past. So a player like Doublelift, who's played for 9 years, was in the Season 1 World Championship, has played in every stage of the league imaginable, from online tournaments to huge stages with large audiences. I think the experienced players will still have an advantage to the inexperienced players, but it's going to be really interesting to see. But to re-answer the initial question, yeah, I think overall this is probably a slight help to TL as they try and move from 6 and 8 into the playoffs. The next one's interesting too. This is from Wilson, whose Twitter handle is @2dank4meme. He says, where do you think COG would be if they started Pobelter at the beginning of the split? Similarly, do you think teams who imported mids would do better / worse with Pobelter, and how much so? This one I actually got into a conversation a couple weeks ago, actually, about how much better CLG looked with Pobelter and where would I power rank them if they would have started Pobelter from the start. And I kind of flippantly said, oh yeah, I think they'd actually be in the hunt for playoffs, which is kind of nuts when you consider that I think at the time they had 2 wins and one of them was with Pobelter. So what I did here is I looked at the games they played with Pobelter, which we can't necessarily change that much. Maybe you could say, oh, if they had a little bit more practice with him, they'd have a higher chance to win. But for the purpose of this explanation, I'm not going to go into it. So they're actually only 2-4 with Pobelter. They've lost to C9, FlyQuest, Immortals, and EG, and they've beaten TL and TSM. So we're just going to take those at face value, put them over in the corner, and say they're 2-4. Now we're talking about the other games they've played. Before they added Pobelter, they lost to Dignitas, FlyQuest, 100 Thieves, TSM. They beat EG. They lost to Immortals. They lost to Golden Guardians. They lost to TL. Now I go through each game individually. The first Dignitas game, Froggen's Victor carried that game 40 minutes in. Crown had low impact, and it was a close game. So looking back at that, and I say Pobelter comes in as an average LCS mid laner, to above average, I think has actually been generally his performance through these 6 games. Just for the sake of this, I'm going to flip that to a CLG win because it was a close game with an underperforming Crown. Their first FlyQuest game. That was the one where Power Beagle's Rumble totally took over. But when I looked around the rest of the map, I felt like this was the game where Wiggly had that really awful flash play in mid lane. I think that's still a loss. The 100 Thieves game that they lost. Crown nearly got solo killed by Ryoma's Zoe as a Lucian in this game and had overall a low performance. I'm going to flip this one and say COG wins with the Pobelter. TSM game, this is the 8% of team's damage on the Blanc game the Crown had. It was against Bjergsen and Syndra though, and Broken Blade's Ornn still had a really good game, and overall it was pretty stompy, so I'm going to say TSM still would have won that one. That one doesn't change. They beat EG with Crown. I think that stays. If they had Pobelter against Immortals, this is the game where they got like mega backdoored and everyone memed them for pulling a COG. I think that game was close enough with Crown playing poorly that if you put Pobelter in there, especially since he's considering a bit of the shot calling for the team, I think that turns into a win. I think their Golden Guardians game, this was Crown's Nico. It was in his last week. He had an 0-4-0 Yasuo game against TL this week and also a really bad Nico game against Golden Guardians. Golden Glue hard carried this game against Crown's Nico. And you could definitely make a strong argument that if Pobelter was there, Golden Glue would not be able to have this type of carry performance. So that's very possibly a win. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to throw it as a 50-50. So overall, I would change their first Dig game to a win, their first 100 Thieves game to a win, their first Immortals loss to a win, and then I'll give them like half a win for that Golden Guardians game because I think looking at the gold graphs and stuff will be pretty close, which puts them at anywhere between 6 and 7 wins and 7 and 8 losses, which means they're actually in the hunt if they had started the season with Pobelter instead of Crown. To the earlier part of the question, where it says, do you think teams who imported mids would do better or worse with Pobelter and how much so? I think in general, kind of yeah. If I look at Immortals or 100 Thieves who've done Aka or Ryoma, I think they probably get one more win with Pobelter. I didn't do the same type of in-depth, go back, check every game that I did with the CLG example, but I think it's hard to argue that it wouldn't be seen as an improvement. But I also wanted to say that that's not completely the point of why these teams didn't pick up Pobelter. While I think there is validity into what Pobelter says of players being able to improve over time, I think Immortals and 100 Thieves both looked at Pobelter and said, hey, here's what we think best Pobelter is, and we're going to try something. We don't need to win this split. I don't think Pobelter would have turned either of those teams into title contenders, so I'm actually okay with them not having Pobelter, if that makes sense. And I think Pobelter is exactly where he should be, where he was a very clear upgrade and has the potential to make a team a playoff team who wouldn't have otherwise been a playoff team, whereas 100 Thieves and Immortals are in the hunt without Pobelter and with their current decisions. So I'm actually kind of fine with that, even though a lot of the storyline is that these teams should just have Pobelter instead of their other guys. It's working out decently for them as they're both in the playoff hunt. Next question is from Roland Biesterveld at Sir Darlin. With supports currently mostly being ward bots and carry protectors like Tom or Yuumi, what do you think needs to shift in the meta, and which LCS support would benefit the most? This one is really interesting to me because tank supports are deeply rooted in the meta. And I kind of classify Yuumi as, this is strange, but because she can go untargetable and jump into anyone she wants, she has some properties of tanks, which are these hard to kill things. But more so, I don't know what needs to change that would actually be good for the game to make tank supports less important or less needed. Because I think the biggest reason you have tank supports is for vision control and face checking brushes with wards. You need to have someone who can safely ward, since the support role is the only role that gets a sightstone because it's been tied so tightly to the quests. And the last time we saw a meta that was healthily not tank supports, junglers could build Tracker's Knife. You had a secondary face checker who could create vision and escape. Even when we had that brief moment last year where Lux was a support, she could effectively check brushes because her E could go in there and give a large amount of vision. So for the most part, unless we're giving other characters more vision tools, which generally hasn't been actually that healthy for the game long term, it's been healthier to remove some vision tools in the game so we get all these educated guesses that we have in the meta right now. I think overall tank supports are just kind of there. So there are some nuanced things within there, like if AD carries overall become more mobile, things like Braum and Tahm Kench and Thresh become less important because you don't need the same amount of protection and peel for your high damage and mobile thing, but then you're also changing that role around. So it's like, right now, I kind of feel like tank supports are this necessary evil to make the game good. They can be a frontline, they can start fights, they can create action, they can run the vision game, but all of those things are just so hard to do with a support squishy enchanter that at the highest pro level, you don't see it. I do think that like top lane supports, like we saw Janna or Lulu, I think those are actually primed for a comeback because there's still a large value in enchanters or ranged support type champions, just not necessarily in that role. And that's my current thought on it. Stephen Buckley. Why won't any professional play Teemo? He provides free damaging wards, stops ADs from attacking, and is cute. This is interesting because I think there's a lot of power in Teemo, and I think he's actually pretty viable through all levels of solo queue, and even for a brief moment in, I think, 2014 summer, High played it against TSM in like a real game and was successful. He played a mid. But overall, I think when you're trying to evaluate a pro champion, it is something that is just at its core different than the way you evaluate it in every other stage of the game. And you kind of have to ask yourself, what is the best thing this champion does? What is this champ's defining trait? And for Teemo, I think the defining trait is the setup you can provide with shrooms. Now, if we think about it, in almost every solo queue environment, that's really hard to deal with. But in a highly coordinated pro environment, it becomes much, much easier to deal with. Pros are really good with sweeper. They'd be really good at finding the right person to clear shrooms, whether that's with shielding or whether that's just avoiding them entirely or whether that's not letting the Teemo set up. If you look at the current meta of top laners, like an Aatrox, a Gangplank, a Mordekaiser, a Set, like those guys are just going to be better in team fights. And it is always hard for Teemo to contribute in team fights. Now, there can definitely be a world where someone puts a bunch of games into Teemo, finds the lane that they can completely smash with it, that can live through 2v1 ganks, which is something that a lot of those other top laners have a high chance of doing when compared to Teemo, then I think we might be able to see him, because his specific trait or purpose in that team would be to decimate the laning phase. But even after that, you still need to have your win condition. Like if a Lucian decimates the laning phase in pro, the win condition is still just absurd power and carry potential in mid-game team fights. Whereas Teemo is still somewhat lacking that thing. So it's a good question. I think those are some of the reasons you don't necessarily team him, because he's like a powerful champion. But I think at the pro level, there are things people can do that just have a lot of counterplay to Teemo when you're paying that much attention. Another champion question from Hershey Lee Williams at Hershey Lee. Why do you think Maokai is just now returning to pro play? I think his kit is ideal for going even or dominating top lane or even support. He has free and vulnerable damage, wards that are empowered by brush, and low CD, powerful CC. I agree. I think Maokai is a strong pick. As to what's bringing him back in the meta and why he wasn't seen before, I have answers. So the Sunfire buff is big. Being able to just get a boost of damage can create a killing threshold where it didn't otherwise exist. I think tanks, especially like Maokai, who are relatively straightforward in their execution, like if I am in range to W, I can force this person into a battle. And if you're winning the stat check, then he's viable. And if you're losing the stat check, he's not viable. And within that, Maokai needs to be able to wash a laning phase or threaten a laning phase, and also stand up in side lanes in the mid game. And I think the champions that have currently been most played in LCS so far, the split, have been Aatrox, Set, Ornn, Gangplank, and Mordekaiser. And if you look across at all those champions, like the Aatrox, the Set, the Ornn, the Mord, Maokai's just losing the stat check to these guys. And once he loses the stat check, he loses pressure in laning phase. And then when they approach a team fight, they're still effective in team fights. And Maokai doesn't have side lane pressure, so he's second there. But now, Set's been nerfed, Ornn's been nerfed, Mord has been nerfed since the start of the year. Maokai has been buffed thanks to the Sunfire that Aatrox can't build, so that power dynamic has shifted a little bit. It means he's a lot closer to all those things, and it means it's a lot closer to Maokai's time. So I actually do think we may even see Maokai this week. I know last week before the LCS got postponed, COG's Ruin had actually played a lot of Maokai top on his like rank 2 solo queue account. So he'd been prepping it, and I think it's totally viable. So hoping to see it. Luke Kattenkamp, at Kattenkamp Luke, says, from your experience doing champion balancing, are there any aspects of champions that the balance team is least likely to change/adjust? Things like abilities/auto ranges seem to be adjusted far less often than things like base stats, cooldowns, and damage ratios. So, yeah, that's a good observation. The ability and auto ranges are adjusted less often, and the reason for that is they have huge field implications. It's really core to a spell how far it reaches, or how far away you have to be someone to auto attack them. And when you change those things, there's not only that feel hit, there's like a big burden of validation that just isn't there with a base stat change or a damage ratio change or a damage base number change, where sure, it's going to be slightly more powerful, but those powers change all throughout the game based off a number of different factors. Like if you're just talking about damage, the armor, MR, and health of the other guy and your own AP stats are always going to shift it anyway. So that slight boost just takes less of a feel thing. So if you're going to change an ability range, you need a very good reason why you can't just do something else, and you need a longer time to validate. So one example of this, when I was buffing Tryndamere, is I thought about giving Tryndamere a little bit of additional attack range, which when I talk to Tryndamere players, it's like really exciting. But also, if you increase his attack range, what happens to auto E? Because a lot of times right now, Tryndamere can auto E, and the E will catch whatever he was auto attacking because it's within his range. As soon as you extend that auto attack range, the auto E breaks. And suddenly you're adding this other skill check within Tryndamere of, oh, if you're going to auto E, you need to actually make sure you're walking within your max attack range rather than just attacking at your max attack range. And it just feels weird. So we ended up going with a different buff. That's just kind of like one example of why ranges are changed so infrequently. So when you're setting ranges in like a champion design start, which I didn't work on, but I just gave feedback to some of these things, like it's pretty important to get it right away. Or if you're going to change it really early on before people develop a large amount of mastery and attachment to those things. All right, 2 more questions. This one from Shuransha NA, who says, what is unique about each region? From players to team styles, and how did they develop the way they did? I don't think it's just the best teams leading the way, because the LCK and LPL styles seem to be similar every year, but they have different top teams each year. This one I'm not going to have all the answers to this question for sure, but I have some ideas that I've talked about in the past. I think you kind of have to answer a bunch of questions to figure out why each region is the way they are. Who has the power? Is it players? Is it coaches? Is it owners? Who do the players look up to? Who were the top teams when League became a thing? Everyone models their game over that. What is the culture of the region like? Is respect based on age a really big thing? Is 16-hour workdays normal? What's your approach to work-life balance? And then also, how are your approaches validated? For instance, on the last one, when G2 won MSI, it validates everyone in the LEC to go all in on what they're doing. Whereas in 2016, when TSM flames out at Worlds, they failed that validation and they decided they had to change. Even if they may have been on the right track, it ends up changing the region in the long term. So the unique things about each regions, I mean, a lot of them are self-explanatory. Like the LPL is much more willing to skill check. They will take a 40-60 because they think their skill will overpower you. The LCK is the reverse of that. They are not willing to skill check because they're looking at the game more like a game of chess, and there's also much more coach power. So it's more approached as a mistake avoidance game rather than an error forcing game. And then if you look at the LCS, like they don't necessarily have a defined style because I feel like they haven't been validated for a while. So a lot of players just look up to LCK players or LCK teams to validate picks because they don't necessarily have the backing or the confidence to try and validate their own stuff. So when they start getting success, you can see more of that. But until that point, it's not as good. An example of this that almost happened was when Uzi and RNG won MSI in 2018. That validated a solo AD carry playstyle as being able to work. And there's also a ton of AD carries, young AD carries that were in the LPL at the time that looked up to Uzi and tried to play exactly the way he played as they were growing. So more people in that region are willing to be incredibly resource hoggy AD carries who try to hard carry the game. Whereas if you look somewhere like, maybe a bad example, but early on EU LCS, when you had Froggen and Peke and all the EU mids who, by being resource heavy, were the carry players, that's kind of where that region started stylistically moving towards. Now it's G2 with their pressure gameplay rather than a more set up, let's be slow and make sure everything is right. There's like, no, we just need to make decisions faster than the other team. And Grabs talked about this on the EU4 podcast. He's like, because of the way we play pressure and because the way LCK is so disciplined, we feel like we are good against them because we can predict the next thing they are doing and just be more rapid. Whereas since LPL just does nothing but skill check all the time, they just skill check us when we're trying to apply pressure and we struggle. So I hope that answered the question, but that's like a really interesting topic of trying to figure out why a region plays the way they do, especially when you start applying it to, okay, how does this region actually get better? Because there's just so many layers to it. And the final question I'm going to talk about in this segment is Julian Carr, Pastry Time, fellow caster. How long should new or rookie players be given in League to prove themselves? And do you feel like the current timelines the public gives are appropriate, too long, or too short? This one's tricky because you don't actually see that often a player who's going to be really good in the end. It happens sometimes. Like it happened with Smeb, where he was bad at the start and then became one of the top laners in the world for a couple years. But overall, I feel like when a player makes their debut, if they're not at least pretty good, I don't think you actually need to give them a huge amount of time. I think the proving of a player can actually be done a little bit more in practice. And this might be a different opinion than what is normally said, but like giving huge amounts of stave time actually shouldn't be as needed as I think a lot of people think it does. And I think the public isn't so much like they need to give more or less time to figure out if a rookie player has proven themselves, but they need to give less credence off of singular moments and try and look more at the bigger picture. An example of this would have been like Mike Young, for instance. He got huge amounts of visibility off of one small moment in Rift Rivals where his Nidalee and other carry junglers were highly effective. And then as soon as the meta shifted, he was unable to continue that level of play and has since struggled to maintain his presence on the professional stage, even though everything about him has seemingly stayed fairly constant from that moment. Like his Nidalee, if it was back in meta, would actually still be really good, but his variety wasn't necessarily there. So you can validate a lot more of these things in practice. And I think that more comes down to just orgs not necessarily listening to the public as much. Like everyone needs to be empowered in these decisions, because I think right now, my biggest issue with current timelines about what the public gives for appropriate short or long-term feedback is like the orgs generally listen to it. That honestly doesn't feel like there's often a huge disconnect between what the public discourse is and what actually happens. And I think a lot of times the public discourse is wrong. A lot of times it's right as well. But I think the orgs need to be leaning in and trusting their own expertise as much as possible. But that's all the questions I pulled for now. I appreciate everyone listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time.